All right, so our last video that we'll cover this week is going to talk about the ending of the war and how the end of the war is going to shape the world that comes after the Second World War. So, even as the war is raging on, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, the big three, as they were often referred to, are conducting meetings to try and plan out the post-war world. Summit meetings were held in Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam to establish things like a military administration for Germany and to try top Nazi leaders for war crimes. Also included in these conferences was the division of Germany that will be dominant in the next several decades. The division between East and West Germany, and then the further division of Berlin as well. We're also going to see some emerging points of tension among these three allies. The relations between the three had often been uneasy, as each one is attempting to maneuver in order to maximize the amount of power and influence that they have in the post-war world. The timing of the Allied invasion of France was a point of contention, in particular with Stalin. Stalin felt that Western leaders had waited far too long to open up that second front, leaving him to deal with the might of the German army for a very long time and costing a lot of unnecessary lives. On the flip side of that, Soviet intentions in Eastern Europe were also a point of contention for the two Western leaders. Stalin wanted to create a buffer zone in Eastern Europe, and the others couldn't easily ignore his demands, as it was Soviet troops that had won the war in the East with very little aid from the others. There was also some tension between the US and the British over the potential dissolution of the British Empire. The United States urged Britain, to place their colonies, for example, India, on a path to independence. And so all of these three leaders had issues with one another. Another conference was called at Bretton Woods in the United States to discuss the new economic order. This conference was attended by 45 nations, and it included discussions over things like the replacement of the British pound with the American dollar as the main currency for international transactions, linking the American dollar's value to the price of gold, something that Roosevelt had undone during the Depression. It was also here that we see the creation of two international organizations, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Both of these organizations would be American dominated. The World Bank was created to provide money to developing countries and to help rebuild Europe after the war. The IMF would work to prevent governments from devaluing their currency in order to gain an advantage in international trade, a practice that was extremely common during the Depression. Both of these organizations were designed to encourage free trade and the growth of the global economy. Now, these decisions have a lot of significance for the post-war capitalist economic system. The first of these is a growing trend towards the removal of trade barriers, like tariffs and things like that. It also represents a formal recognition of the United States as the world's financial leader. It is also in a series of conferences following the Second World War that we get the discussion of a new international organization, a successor to the League of Nations, if you like. A planning conference was held at Dumbarton Oaks, again in the United States, to discuss the structure of this new organization, the United Nations. The United Nations would be made up of a General Assembly of all member states and a Security Council. The Security Council would be further divided into 5 permanent members: the US, Britain, China, the Soviet Union, and France, all of whom would have veto power over decisions, and then 6 rotating members. The United Nations Charter was formally adopted at a conference in San Francisco in June of 1945, where representatives from 51 different countries met to approve the charter. The charter included things like a clause which outlawed threat of force as a means of settling international disputes. The endorsement of the United Nations Charter came from the U.S. Senate barely a month later in July of 1945 as well. At the end of the war and following all of these conferences and meetings, we see the establishment of a new world order, which included a radical redistribution of power. Germany and Japan, which had been dominant military powers in their regions, were utterly defeated. Britain and France, which had been traditional leaders both militarily and economically, were substantially weakened. And newcomers, the US and the Soviet Union, gained significant influence, with the United States emerging as a dominant world power overall, but we would be significantly challenged for that position by the Soviet Union. Ultimately, the end of the Second World War produced peace in that we weren't fighting, but it didn't really produce harmony. The Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe created a division that would be solidified by the Cold War. The dropping of the bombs left a worldwide legacy of fear as a nuclear arms race would come into effect by the end of the decade. Wilson's For Freedom speech, something that we'll discuss more in depth when we talk about America's home front, also helped lay the foundation for post-war ideals of human rights that would extend to all mankind. But these created some disputes, particularly over how these freedoms would apply to colonial peoples and non-white people in the United States, and ultimately foretold of more wars and social upheavals to come. So that's going to wrap us up for this week. Next week, we're going to look at the American home front and some of these changes that I'm talking about more in depth.